So I created a tentative essential and accidental dignities table, which I use to basically figure out how strong planets are in a given chart, be it, well, any kind of chart, natal, horary, whatever. And there's many methods of doing this. Basically, its method is to help you find the almuten of a chart, but it's really nice to be able to figure out how strong planets are, so you know from the get-go how someone's made, basically, and what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. There are essential dignities, which are basically where the planet sits in the zodiac. If I go to one of these, where a planet sits in the zodiac has fixed properties. These are like the most essential properties. There's a calculator in SolarFire. There's actually a couple that say essential dignities, but it's not just essential dignities. They put accidentals in there, but they don't tell you what goes on in the back end. And so it gives these points, which kind of help, but they're not very accurate, and they don't tell you why they give you those points. Sometimes it makes sense, and sometimes it doesn't. There is a chart similar to the one I'm showing you here that William Lilly has in his book, and it's decent, it's good. However, it's good, but I do think that it's a bit incomplete. I think it can be improved. And so I made a tentative list or a table really of essential and accidental dignities that is more complete. I don't think it's the most complete, but it's sort of the bare bones framework for something that I think could be a much better method of evaluating planets. Now again, if you're evaluating a planet, a number isn't going to tell you everything. But I think it's useful because some people think that if you use a number that you're not reading into it enough. You're not figuring out why that planet is the way it is. And that's true. But again, the number helps to start with. And it gives you if you take into account everything and distill it down to one factor, that's a nice baseline to start from. So I have the essential dignity, nothing special here. It tells if a planet's in any of its dignities. Then there's mutual receptions, which are actually pretty rare because for there to be a true mutual reception, the planets have to be in aspect, a Ptolemaic aspect. Or I think you can make an exception for Antigia or Contra Antigia, because they do connect, even though it's not by a true aspect. It's like kind of like a midpoint. But there's different types of mutual reception. There's reception by rulership, by sign, which is the most obvious, but there's by exaltation, by triplicity, and by term, and actually by decan as well, but I kind of just don't count that. It gets buried by everything else. I don't know, I guess you could include that, but you have situations more often where you have a situation where a planet is in a sign of exaltation and the other's in the sign of its term. And so there is mutual benefit, but it's just way attenuated from the maximum, like if they're both in exaltation or they're both in each other's signs. So I have a table here to account for that. If there's like small receptions, then you can include that. And there's the one-way receptions. I don't know, jury's kind of out on that. I do think that you could include them if you want, but I don't think the effect is as powerful if it's a one-sided gain. Whereas if it's two-sided, the planets really, they benefit from each other mutually, and that's where the power comes in. It's not just the one gets some benefit. Anyway, the moon, if it's increasing in light, it gets points. If it's decreasing in light, it loses points. If it's under the bond and applying to a malefic, that's bad. If it's applying to a benefic, that's good. Under the bond basically means if the moon is full within, the orb of the sun, which is probably like 15 degrees, it's going to be sort of not operating the normal way. It's going to be under the influence of the sun and under the influence of the sign that it's in. It's not going to be influenced by planets, by aspect, or by conjunction the way it would normally be. However, once it comes out from under the bond, whether if it's a prevention or a conjunction, meaning if it's a new moon or a full moon, basically when it's invisible and when it's full, those are the times where it's under the bond. When it comes out of the bond, it's going to be very sensitive to whatever aspect comes next. And if it's to a malefic, the moon's going to be very hurt. So, and consequently, if it's benefic, moon's going to be better. So no matter what sign it's in, if it's coming out and it's being badly or well influenced, that's going to affect the quality of the moon in the chart. And if it's via combusta, it's going to lose points. I don't know, maybe 5 is a bit excessive, but I believe that was in Lily's chart as well. He counts if it's in via combusta, the burnt way. It's basically 15 Libra to 15 Scorpio, I believe. And then here comes, your standard accidental dignities. If it's angular, basically, it gets points. If it's cadent in the bad houses, it loses points. And it goes right down to the least of the good houses and the least of the worst houses. And you have joys. I included all of the different types of planetary joys that seem to make sense. So you have the sign of joy, meaning if it's masculine or feminine. Each planet is predisposed to be masculine or feminine. And so if it's in a like sign, it's going to perform better. Mercury is masculine or feminine depending on the solar phase. And this is very important, but I don't think it's emphasized enough. Mercury, if he's morning star, if he rises before the sun, that means he's going to be masculine. If he's evening star, he's going to be feminine. And so if he's morning star, he wants to be the masculine signs, if he's, vice versa. Now, the house of joy, every planet has a house of its joy. Okay, I got some astrology tables here there's orbs of the planets, there's speed of the planets, which is like insanely important. I might do a video on that. Here we go, planetary joys. So I have a table that describes all of, like Saturn's masculine, so he wants to be morning star. He wants to be in the same hemisphere as the sun in like a day chart or in a night chart. He wants to be in the same hemisphere. And he wants to be in the 12th house. That's the house where he does the best in, probably because he reduces the bad of the 12th house. And so every planet has its own special house that it does better in, basically. And joy by solar phase is basically, again, corresponding with its gender. So if it's masculine, it wants to be morning star. If it's feminine, it wants to be evening star. Mercury can go either way. It totally depends. If it's masculine, it wants to be in the same hemisphere as the sun. If it's feminine, it wants to be in the opposite hemisphere of the sun, which doesn't happen very often. But basically, the joy by hemisphere is where it's a condition of haze, where a planet it's not so much day or night chart, but it's more so, if it's a night chart, you want the night planets to be on the other side. So actually you want the night planets to be above the horizon. And in a day chart, you want the night planets to be below the horizon. And you want the day planets to be where the sun is, on the upper or lower, depending on where the sun is. So it's the same or opposite, depending on the gender. And there's quadrants. I don't know, this one isn't used as much, but quadrant conformity is if it's in the masculine quadrants, obviously masculine. If it's in the feminine quadrants, then feminine. And the first and third quadrants are the 10th, 11th, and 12th houses, and the 4th, 5th, and 6th houses. And then the ones catty-cornered to that, 2nd, 4th quadrants, those are the feminine ones. And so if planets land in their proper quadrants, they gain some accidental dignity by that. It's a little less than I'd say than any others. Maybe even 2 is excessive, and I don't know, I wanted a factor to separate planets that were sort of averse or not in their right places. So I wanted some point reduction there. I don't know, jury's kind of out on whether or not to give or not give or have any of that. So Cazimi, I guess most authors write Cazimi as has to be within 17 minutes of the sun. I've seen variants of either up to 1 degree from the sun, but I've also seen half degree, but 17 minutes is, I forgot who came up with that. I think it was Abu Mashar might have said that. But otherwise, it's known as being combust. Supposedly, and I don't remember the source, but Demetra George says in some of the medieval texts, if the sun is in Aries or in Leo, where it's in good shape, and Mercury's with him, and he's combust, he doesn't get affected by it. Like, he doesn't get anything bad happen to him, basically. Which, I don't know. I've not really seen evidence either way on that, but that's just what I've heard. Any other time, combustion is like one of the worst things that can happen to a planet. It just completely debilitates it and hides its ability. It hides its effects, but it also curtails its ability to really perform the way it normally would. As you get out I think it's plus or minus 8 degrees from the sun. Now, again, like I said, it's helical phases, everything's different, but once you get far enough away from the sun, it's considered to be under the beams, which is still bad, but it's less bad than if it's really burnt, if it's really close. And if it's free from the beams of the sun, that's good. That means it can operate in its own power. And if a planet's increasing in light, meaning it's getting brighter, like the sun's moving away from it, or it's moving away from the sun, that gets points. But if the sun's moving toward it and it's getting not occulted really, but like overpowered by the sun, or the planet's changing in brightness or whatever, it's decreasing in light, it's going to lose points. Now, this next section is actually very complicated. In fact, actually, I might skip it just for now. I want to do the rest of the these accidentals before I go back to this section. So I added a section for improper face. If you know what that is, it's basically the planets are in the same order as they were in the Thema Mundi in the beginning, and that it gets some manner of dignity. I don't really think it affects that much, so I just gave it 1 point, but it's a little bonus. And these dignities here come from Lily's table, and I may be sort of built suspenders, like I'm doing this twice. I don't really need to, because you're basically saying if the masculine planets are oriental, they get points. If they're occidental, they lose points, and vice versa for the feminine planets. They're oriental. Now they roped in Mercury here in the oriental or in the feminine planets, but in reality, I think Mercury depends on his helical phase. It depends on which side of the sun he's on, whether he's masculine or feminine. So I altered this slightly. Venus and Moon are obviously feminine. So if they're oriental, they're going to lose points. If they're occidental, they're going to gain points. Mercury can go either way. So depending on the sign Mercury's in, and depending on the helical phase, he'll gain or lose points, depending on what sign he's in. It's a little different for Mercury, but I think it fits better than just shoehorning him in as one of the feminine planets, because that's just not the way he is. Curtailed passage. I had to add this because if planet's either rising or setting, but once it gets past 120 degrees away from the sun, it's said to be achronical, meaning when the sun sets, that planet rises, or when the sun rises, that planet sets, and that's just different. That's a different effect than if it's oriental or occidental, if it's evening or morning. And when in curtailed passage, in the middle, when the planet is very much retrograde, like the fastest retrograde it will be, it becomes completely opposite. This happens to Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. I have that in my chart. Jupiter's completely opposite the sun, within 1 degree, actually. It's in what's said curtailed passage, because it's in its own light, but when the sun rises, it dips under the horizon. So it's sort of like it gets, curtailed. It's operating its own light, but it's spaced from the sun such that it doesn't operate maybe in its best manner. So it loses points for that, because in curtailed passage, it's sort of like it's invisible, but it's not because of the sun's rays. It is because of the sun's rays, but it's just different. And the ancients did consider this. Curtailed passage was a thing that they considered, because the planet's retrograde. The planet's always retrograde when it's in curtailed passage, first of all. So that always means it's going to be somewhat stunted in its expression anyway. And of course, if you have any of the planets conjunct the nodes, this is straight out of Lily's book, this is considered not good. If it's direct, if it gets points. If it's retrograde, it really loses points. If it's fast or slow in motion, it gains or loses points. And I have a whole table here that I have written on the speeds, because I have the average daily speed of each planet, and if it's faster or slower than this range, then it's said to be fast or slow. If it is just between these ranges, if it's just average, I don't give or lose points. I just put 0. I just put 0. I only give or lose points if it's like really fast or really slow. If it's conjunct the benefics, it gains points. If it's conjunct the malefics, it loses points. If it's applying to a trine, if it's applying to a good aspect with the benefics, that's good. If it's applying to a bad aspect with the malefics, it loses points. Pretty standard stuff. The ancients all use this idea. This is straight out of Lily's book, but this goes way back. This is just, there's nothing new here. Assistance and besieging, that's basically if it's between benefics or between malefics. If it's between benefics, a planet will be helped unless it's intercepted by a ray from a malefic. And it's the same for malefics as well. If the planet's between Saturn and Mars and no benefic is there to save it by striking a ray, it'll be maltreated, but they call maltreated, which is basically it's really hurt by the malefics, more so than it would be otherwise. So you can have one malefic strike a ray, but when you have two besieging it, when it's separating from one and applying to another, that is like pretty bad. And same if it's benefic, so you can have a planet become way more powerful just because it's assisted by the benefics. Also, you have, of course, Void of Course, but he made a distinction. I don't know if Lily did. I don't know what. This is from a different book, but it's medieval astrologers made the distinction between Void of Course and Feral. Now, there's like 3 different definitions of Void of Course, but the general idea is that out of sign aspects are not very strong. In fact, I kind of don't count them. I acknowledge them, but I don't treat them like normal aspects if they were in the proper signs. And so they lose like a certain degree of power. Like it's there, but it doesn't have the potency that it would. So that's why when a planet gets near the end of a sign and it's made its last aspect, it's said to be Void of Course. That's the modern definition. Lily's definition is that if it's within orb of another planet, even if it's in the next sign, that it's not Void of Course. I don't know. I tend to think there's something to the late in the sign idea that is important, but I also think that that using orbs is a better method. I don't know. Feral is actually really rare. That probably more lines up with the Hellenistic definition of Void of Course, which is if it's not making any aspect whatsoever in the sign, the entire sign, it's just completely in aversion to all the planets and through that whole sign, then it's said to be feral. It's actually pretty rare, but it's said to be way worse than Void of Course because it's sort of like that planet has nothing to adhere to, especially if it's the moon. A Void of Course planet or feral or Void of Course moon in a chart is kind of not a good thing because it's like that person's not going to have a home behavior or disposition. It's like they're always wandering. They don't really know where they're going or what they're doing, and even if they tried, they couldn't. It's just sort of like it's a weird effect. I also counted if it's in haze. Haze basically is if a planet is in... Oh, okay, I've actually seen different definitions of this. The one I kind of use is if a planet's in its proper hemisphere, if it's on the correct side of the chart, basically. If it's masculine, it wants to be with the sun. If it's feminine, it wants to be away from the sun. And if it's in its proper sign. So like Saturn, for instance, it's got to be on the same hemisphere as the sun, and it's got to be in a masculine sign. If that's the case, then it's in haze. Again, with Mercury, it depends. Dastoria is like another... It's like haze, but with a few more conditions. I forgot it's really particular. It's extremely rare, but you get... It's almost worth not putting on here, but I put it on here anyway, just in case. It's supposed to be haze, but with more conditions on it. And so I think like Jim Morrison has planets in Dastoria or something like that. I don't remember what it is offhand, but I might talk about it in a different video, who knows. But it's basically haze, but better. It's like you have planets, you have benefics in the 10th from the sun or something, and so that like affects it better, and I don't know. But I'm going to talk about this other section that I skipped over, the condition of the lords. Because when you're looking at a chart, you got to look at not just the sign the planet's in, but the lords of that planet, to properly evaluate its condition. So I added this huge section, this comprehensive section. This is the most difficult thing to weight by number because it's complicated. And I'm not sure I did it completely right, but this is a start, I think. So you check to see if a planet aspects its domicile lord. If it does not, it loses points, because in a chart, if the planet is peregrine and it doesn't aspect its domicile lord, that's bad. That means it's not going to get the resources it needs. Exaltation Lord, same thing. Gets less points, but also loses less points. Triplicities, Term Lords, anything that can give the planet help in a peregrine sign, or even in its own sign, it's going to gain or lose points. And so you can have planets that are not domicile, but they have all these other dignities, and they're in their with their sect mates and with their triplicity lords. Well, that's going to very much help them. And so I go through all of it. I look for aspects. Now, if a planet's in its own sign, I don't put any. I put like 0 basically, because you can't have the planet aspect itself, in my opinion. So I just don't count it. If it's domicile, I don't count some of these. If it's in its own term, whatever. But down here, when it says domicile lords and rulership, I do give points. If it's in its own rulership, it will get 5 points. So I look for domicile rulership, exaltation rulership, and I look for triplicity, term, decan, exaltation, lord, and I right down to the triplicity lords. And if it's domicile lords in fall, or basically if it's domicile lords or triplicity lords are not well dignified either, it loses points. And the idea is that you weight the planet based on how well it's supported. If it's supported by a planet that's really powerful, well, it's going to bode well for the planet that's peregrine. But if the planet that's peregrine is supported poorly by equally deficient planets, well, it's not going to benefit very much, if at all. So I go right down here to all the triplicity lords, day, night, and cooperating triplicity lords for each. I weight them equally. Some people only use the day ruler. I use all three. I don't know. That's just me. And if it's an exaltation, if it's in rulership, right down to term or decan. And I check if the term lord's in rulership, because again, the term lord determines, it sets the bounds for the planet of what it can and can't do. And if it's powerful, it's going to help. If it's not powerful, it's not. I don't get into the minutia of counting if it's not in its own sign, if it's peregrine, but I do count if it's in detriment. And I try and weight these points by manner of importance. So if it's, if I'm talking about domicile rulership, it's going to be a lot of points. If I'm talking about term lords or face lords being in their correct signs, I'm talking just a couple of points, because that's not as important. And I don't know, that's a tentative list I have for trying to evaluate a planet. I don't know, I'm constantly tweaking this to make it better, but I think I'm on to something here, because I've never seen anywhere, there are no calculators online that will do this. They're so cryptic, and they're just not very useful, honestly. They tell you kind of what goes on. You can tell a lot by just looking at the essential dignities. That's going to give you a baseline to start from, but it's not going to tell you everything. If you're really trying to narrow down, okay, how is this planet really doing, you're not really going to know until you look at everything. And unless you want to know the almuten, the most powerful planet in the chart, is generally considered by most astrologers to be the almuten of the chart, or the victor. That's kind of important as well. It's nice to understand that if you want to figure someone out. This is going to give you a way more accurate method of doing that, basically, than some of these calculators will, unfortunately. If you see here, it's just very cryptic. There's a different one I'll show you. There's a horary one that says essential dignities of Ptolemy. If you look at Ptolemy's essential dignities, it is simple. It's like what I have on my chart, or on my table, but it's like there's more points being scored for accidental stuff that isn't talked about. Maybe Ptolemy really does introduce some accidental dignities that are not normally talked about, but I don't know, they don't tell you what's going on in the back end, and it fucking bothers me. It's just stupid, because you don't know. I know it's not accurate. It's not nearly as comprehensive as the one I just made. The one I made has massive variations in the points. I've seen anywhere, the theoretical maximum and minimum is huge, but it gives you an idea in someone's chart. You can really tell when you add everything up, kind of how well someone's got it. If all their planets are fucking -50, you're going to be wondering why you complain about anything in life, because they're way worse off. But, I hate to say that, but you get the point. You can look at someone, and most of the time when someone's past their childhood, they've learned enough about their strengths and weaknesses to know better. But when you look at someone's chart and you haven't really met them yet, you can get a much better idea about how they kind of go about the world just based on this, because you'll know what their strengths and weaknesses are much more readily. I found this to be very useful, and I'm sort of battle testing it right now. It's not 100%, but I wanted to get this out there because I've not seen really anyone talk about this or make something that is, comparable to this at all. This table takes forever to fill out. It is annoying. I really wish I could make a program that would do this. Well, that's sort of in the works. I am not a programmer, but I'm trying to make basically an astrology program that just beats the tar out of these other ones, because a lot of these programs, some of the free ones are actually better than the paid ones. It's kind of sad, honestly. I don't want to bag on Solar Fire that much, but it's just, I should just stop ranting. I'm going to get pretty nasty here. It's just ridiculous. Placidus is kind of same thing. It has some great capabilities, but some of the shortcomings and glitches, it's just come on, man. You could have done better than that. I don't know. One little bit at a time, I'm fixing these problems and informing people, hopefully. I hope you guys found this helpful.